Max Wolf, I think we should get started.
Yeah, I think so. One second. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Charles River Regional Chamber's annual real estate forum. I'm Max Wolf, the Chamber's Public Policy and Government Relations Manager. We truly did not expect to ever bring this event back to Zoom after the COVID years, but here we are, and we really appreciate everyone's flexibility with the format change. I want to start by thanking our sponsors, Needham Bank, Essence Social Real Estate Team, Village Bank, and the UMass Amherst Charles River campus. As you know, the housing crisis is our region's #1 economic issue and arguably our biggest competitive disadvantage as well. It's something the chamber has really leaned into at every opportunity. And for the past several years, that opportunity has been with the implementation of the MBTA Communities Act, both statewide and in our four communities. It was actually the central topic of our 2023 real estate forum. But MBTA Communities was never going to be the only solution to our housing problem. And now we're looking beyond that to what happens next. In today's program, we'll hear from a panel of housing experts who will walk us through some of the next ideas that will be considered and thought through on Beacon Hill. And then those same experts will get real-time feedback from Watertown State Senator William Brownsberger, a current member of the Joint Committee on Housing. But before that, we thought it'd be really important to close the chapter on MBTA communities to really understand its strengths and limitations and how it played out on the ground. To help us do that, we're lucky to be joined by Katie Einstein. Katie is an associate professor of political science and director of undergraduate studies at Boston University and co-author of a 2025 Greater Boston Housing Report Card right here. We'll send it out afterwards. It's a great read. Katie spent years studying how housing policy actually works or doesn't once it meets local politics. And with that, I'll turn it over to Katie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. I'm really excited for the panel too, and looking forward to sharing with you some of the results from this research. Um, I apologize for the somewhat unaesthetic PDF I'm sharing. Zoom's latest update is not playing nicely with Mac computers, so thank you for bearing with me with not being able to go into slideshow mode. So as Max said, this work comes from research that I did with my BU colleague, Max Palmer, and we were really interested in understanding how MBTC was actually implemented on the ground in local communities in sort of detail, right? And one of our big goals, which I think is going to be sort of the main focus of this panel, was really thinking about this policy from a forward-looking perspective. What can we learn from this policy implementation, and how can we use those lessons when we're designing our housing policy going forward? So a lot of the media attention about MBTA-C focused on sort of a dichotomous question. Which communities were complying and which ones are not complying? So there was a lot of ink spilled over Milton's fight with the state attorney general and with other communities that sort of opted not to comply with the law at all. So here you can see this is a chart with data that is up to date as of this fall when we released the report, showing sort of which communities were compliant and non-compliant, right? So a lot of attention was paid to those yellow communities. But we actually think we can learn a lot more about policy implementation by understanding important dynamics and variations between some of those green and purple communities. We think that that attention that was really paid to those non-compliant communities leads us to miss sort of important differences in how communities complied with this state law. So when we think about, right, what we really focused on was variation among compliers. And we used a variety of different data sources to do this. So we were able to get HLC data for 177 communities. We had information on their full plans. In addition, we also did detailed case studies, including interviews and analysis of meeting minutes and archival evidence from Lexington, Needham, and Wellesley. Our key findings are that within those compliers, some communities and towns intentionally zoned for growth, while others did not. The vast majority of communities avoided single-family neighborhoods, and this comports broadly with national trends that communities are really hesitant to touch those single-family neighborhoods, and that Americans in general seem to have like a pretty fierce attachment to those types of communities, which may prove to be sort of an important obstacle to housing policy reform. When we think about some of the key insights that we derived from our detailed case studies, we found that effective public outreach and organization can lead to high levels of housing production. So there's some room for optimism from these analyses. We also found in some communities that state policies can be weaponized as tools of housing opposition, and there may be opportunities for the state to think about how they might adjust funding formulas or even just communicate state policies more effectively to prevent that weaponization. We also found that local ballot referendums and even the threat of referendums make it really hard to build new housing and to zone aggressively for new housing. Okay, so looking broadly, starting with this bird's eye view and our analysis of 177 communities, we found that most towns zoned very close to their mandated units, but we want to note that some communities really took MBTA-C as an opportunity to plan for growth and actually went much higher than what was required by the state law. Importantly, however, almost no zoned capacity is in current single-family neighborhoods, right? So when we look overall again at those 177 communities, a plurality of them placed none of their zoned capacity, 0% of it, in single-family parcels, and an overwhelming majority, when we sort of combine that 0% and 10% category, placed their zoned capacity in fewer than 10% of single-family parcels, right? So single-family parcels, right, sort of looking at these data by and large, were really untouched by MBTA-C. And you're going to see that trend pop up again when we look at these three communities, right? So when we dug into Lexington, Needham, and Wellesley, we're going to see that
private Medicare plans flat next year. Plus, the insurance giant sees its first annual revenue drop in over 30.
So we are going to find variations in compliance in Lexington, Needham, and Wellesley. And to sort of preview what we find in our case studies, we find that Lexington has this ambitious plan that zoned well above minimum requirements, including in a few single-family neighborhoods. Lexington has sort of very prominently had a scaling back, but even with that scaling back, they are going to produce thousands of new units of housing. In Needham, there was an initially ambitious plan that was ultimately overturned in a ballot referendum, and it was replaced with a very aptly named base compliance plan. Neither plan included single-family neighborhoods. Finally, in Wellesley, there was a no drama compliance. There were no sort of big fights at public meetings. There were no ballot referendum. But in practice, maybe one of the reasons that it was no drama is that this policy change is going to allow for very little new housing beyond what was already in the pipeline. And as with Needham, no single-family neighborhoods were included in this plan. So looking at some maps here, and unfortunately because of the slideshow issues, these are probably very small. I'll be sharing these slides afterwards if people are eager to zoom in on particular parcels or dig in. But the big takeaway to have looking at this map, there's this little purple category here for single family upzoned neighborhoods. And you can see that there are indeed some places in Lexington where they upzoned single family neighborhoods. You are not going to really see that again in the other communities that we studied in depth. In Needham, right, here we can see, and this is the base compliance plan. This is the one that ultimately passed. You can see that they don't really touch single family parcels, right? There are none of those sort of purple categories for single family upzoned neighborhoods. And you can also see for one of the commuter rail stops, Hersey, it was untouched by the plan. And you can see sort of from the parcel data there, this was an area that was largely single family housing that the community opted to sort of not touch at all in its plan. Finally, in Wellesley, I think it's a really similar pattern to what we see in Needham. I just want to flag one of the areas that really helped Wellesley to get to that capacity was actually this sort of zone near Waban, where they were able to take advantage of a project that was already in the pipeline to get to their sort of MBTA-C numbers. So it doesn't really produce meaningful amounts of new housing. Because I know that there are a few sort of Charles River communities, especially Watertown and Newton, we didn't study these in depth for our report, but I at least wanted to show you guys some comparable maps just to give you a sense of how Watertown and Newton compare to those communities. So you can see here in Watertown, there's a big cluster, right? The area that they primarily upzoned was sort of very intentionally designed to revitalize Watertown Square. So there are not a lot of single family neighborhoods that are proposed, but that sort of makes sense in the context of Watertown having a relatively lower number of single family parcels compared to the other communities that we studied. And finally, in Newton, again, I think the pattern looks relatively similar to what we saw in Wellesley and Needham, where single family neighborhoods are largely avoided here. And we see that there are some sort of mass transit stops, right, notably like in Chestnut Hill, where we aren't really seeing a lot of zoned capacity. And again, I will be providing these slides to you all if you're eager to sort of zoom in and look at particular areas to really get down in the weeds about which parcels were upzoned. So just to briefly summarize from the case studies that we did in depth, which again, that's Lexington, Needham, and Wellesley, some of the insights that we derived, one of the sort of big takeaways that we had from Lexington's process was a very effective public outreach. So they had the good fortune of just completing a comprehensive planning process, which, unlike the other communities we studied, outlined very ambitious housing growth targets. They also held Zoom public meetings that focused on respectful and focused dialogue, which was unfortunately not always the case for these public hearings. So I am right next door in Arlington, and we had a meeting where the police had to be called, that it became so contentious. And so I think managing to get these conversations to be respectful and focused helps to encourage sort of a broader form of participation. Finally, there was very strong support from just sort of a variety of prominent stakeholders. There were a number of state and local leaders who sort of happened to live in Lexington and came to town meeting and spoke forcefully in favor of the town's MBTA-C plan. And I think those kinds of endorsements can make a difference and change the kind of dialogue that you're having at town meeting. So turning to Needham, one theme that jumped out to us at Needham was the way that state policies were weaponized by some housing opponents as a way of clawing back the plan. So Needham actually initially passed an ambitious upzoning plan that was fairly similar to Lexington's plan in scope, and it really targeted growth. But there was a well-organized ballot referendum campaign that emphasized these physical challenges from growth, especially in the schools. So there was a lot of sort of concern that building more housing would put a major financial burden on the schools. They were in the process of doing some new school construction. I want to stress the best empirical evidence that we have from Massachusetts suggests that building new housing does not increase school costs, but that perception is absolutely there. And when we interviewed sort of key housing leaders, they told us that they wished that if they could go back, they would have emphasized some of the economic benefits of building more housing and tried to assuage some of those economic fears because they were so important in the ballot referendum campaign. Right? So I think one interesting difference that we saw, Needham and Wellesley, right, very similar communities on a lot of dimensions, but had very different MBTA-C processes. And one of the ways that we saw sort of important differences was in how they managed housing opposition. So Wellesley, from the get-go, had the ethos of like, this has to pass town meeting. And so we are going to propose something that is uncontroversial that will get through town meeting. And the easiest way to do that in a community like Wellesley that has some pretty entrenched anti-housing sentiment is to propose a plan that is not going to, in reality, build a lot of new housing or change a whole lot. right? And so you can juxtapose that to what happened in Needham, where we have this ballot referendum that ultimately overturns this policy. And sort of the reality, right, that, one public official told us that busy people lose interest in conversations about zoning, right? This is, I teach zoning. I try to make it super exciting, but I get it. No one wants to talk about zoning for 6 months or 10 months. And that makes deep education efforts really challenging. And I want to stress this is like not a Needham specific problem. In general, housing has struggled in Massachusetts and in other places when it is put to voters in off-cycle referendums. So in conclusion, sort of what we take away from this and what we think about this as forward-looking policy is that there was really big variation in what compliance looks like. When we leave things up to local government, some of them are going to choose to build a lot and some of them are going to choose not. The politics of upzoning is generally quite difficult and nearly impossible in single-family neighborhoods. But to leave us on a positive note, one silver lining I take from Lexington, even though they have rolled back their initially ambitious plan, there are thousands of units in the pipeline. It is a massive amount of housing growth in a town of 33,000 people. And so we can take success even from initially ambitious plans that are rolled back, because that is going to fundamentally lead to really important change there. So thank you so much again for being here. And I look forward to hearing from the panel, and I'm happy to answer questions that folks have.
Thank you, Katie. Much appreciated. And we will have you stick around at the end so you can be part of our conversation. I did want to say that Boston Indicators, who you collaborated with on this report, is releasing tomorrow a report that's going to show some numbers in terms of what's actually being built or what's been approved or in the pipeline. So that'll be really important. I think we know that that's going to show in our communities that Watertown is permitted and is moving forward with a lot of things. In Watertown Square as part of their zoning. Newton has several projects, some sizable, and Needham a couple as well. I'm not aware of anything in Wellesley. Is kind of not surprising from what you've seen, but we'll get a better look at that tomorrow when Boston Indicators report comes out. So thank you for that. We are going to go in a minute to our panel where we're going to talk not so much, we'll look back at MBTA Communities briefly, but really the idea and the rest of this program here is the idea is to focus on ideas going forward and what's next after MBTA Communities. But I think it's important whenever we have these conversations to make sure we also hear from the business community directly and not just from the folks who are in the trenches trying to shape policy. So I've invited Joe Campanelli, who is the CEO of Needham Bank, to join us. Joe has been an articulate and consistent voice for the need to address our housing needs. So I've asked Joe to say a few words about why housing is so important to our economy. Joe, we are grateful to have you and your time today. So thank you. Good morning.
Hey, thank you, Greg. And I'll just take a moment because I'm also interested in hearing from our panel. Obviously, with the MBTA bill, it's a positive, but it's not one size doesn't fit all. And I think we have to be very innovative and creative in how we create more housing. When we talk about affordable, I think across the spectrum, there's not enough housing in general throughout all of our markets. And it's something that really is going to be important that we retain. Passing a law on rent control is not going to work. I've already talked to hundreds of investors that are looking at Massachusetts now saying, we'll just invest down south. We'll move our dollars somewhere else. So we really need to find ways to increase supply across the board. And I think the chamber taking a leadership role is very, very important. And I believe we all can take a role in all of our communities. There's too much of that not my backyard mindset. But if we don't, the very our grandkids and our kids that want to stay in this region will have to be traveling to go see them for sure. And I hate to see all these bright young minds leaving the region to go down to North Carolina. The Research Triangle's booming. Nashville continues to grow and take talent away from us. And I think the one critical asset we have here is our brain power, our employee base. And if they can't live in close proximity, they're going to vote with their feet. So I encourage the panel to help us look at things differently and a little more creative. And thanks, Greg, and the whole team for sponsoring this today or putting it together. I think it's critically important.
Joe, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Now, I've been told my audio is it any better now than it was a minute ago, or is it like this? Can somebody tell me? That one's better?
The second one's better, Greg.
This one here is good? Yes?
Yep, much better.
Great. Thanks very much. All right. Thank you again, Joe. Appreciate your time. Okay, so we're going to go to our housing panel. Our panelists today include three people that the Chamber has worked very closely with over the years and will be familiar to many people here. Rachel Heller, who is CEO of CHAPA, the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, although Rachel is soon to be the executive director of another really important group, which is the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. Jesse Canson-Beninoff, who's the executive director of Abundant Housing Massachusetts, and Andrew McCullough, who is Senior Housing Fellow at the Pioneer Institute for Public Policy Research. Friends, thanks so much for being here and being part of this. Really appreciate it. And we really appreciate the work that you do each and every day on behalf of this and trying to grow our housing supply and affordability. Really grateful. So we're also going to be a little bit putting Senator Will Brownsberger on the spot and asking him for his take on some of the ideas that our panelists are going to bring forward. So we'll look forward to that. But before we get into the housing ideas, I'd love to just hear from the panel about MBTA communities and how you feel that was. Was it useful for all the blood, sweat, and tears that were shed in that battle? Was it good? Was it bad? Was it meh? Rachel, I'm going to start with you. What's kind of the report now, your take now on how MBTA communities work? And Rachel, you're on mute. Okay.
About that.
Yeah.
I think the MBTA Communities Act was huge. It was a huge shift for Massachusetts. We need 222,000 new homes over the next 10 years, and it really requires state and local action to get there. So the MBTA Communities Act was this big change in how zoning is decided at the local level by the state, saying we need housing. We're going to focus on housing around transit, and we need the communities to figure out where these districts are going to go and how that's going to help us move forward. What I think was really exciting about it is one is that shift, right? That we're actually the state and the communities are actually, state is mandating, communities are then planning. And that's, I think, a really important point too, that communities were planning. I think for too long, we've been using zoning to say no, and we haven't been planning. Our planning boards are really stuck responding. Now, communities have started planning. Where are we allowing growth? How does that growth help us to meet our goals? So for me, the MBTA Communities Act, I see it as a really big shift and a step in the right direction. And now we need to keep going with that.
Great, thank you. Jesse, what do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Rachel. Every point that she made is spot on. The reality is, when MBTA Communities was passed in 2021, we recognized there was already an extreme shortage of homes in Massachusetts, which was driving cutthroat competition and driving up prices for everyone. And so we needed to do something. And now, 5 years later, 165 communities have by right zoning for multifamily housing, many of which never had any by right zoning to allow apartments to be built, particularly near transit. And so that's huge. I think we're learning about what else we need to do, and we're going to have that conversation here. But it was a sea change for Massachusetts, recognizing that we need to build housing for people at all income levels in order to help stem the population loss, to give seniors in our communities a place to downsize in their community. And I think it was a success for that. I think obviously there is more to be done. We're not going to build 222,000 or more homes that we need in the state with MBTA communities alone. So I look forward to that conversation. But yeah, the fact that we have so many communities that have now zoned for apartments that never did before, I think is critical.
And Andrew, MBTA communities, good, bad, or meh? Good, bad, or
It was good. I'll agree with Rachel and Jesse that it was a sea change in terms of, the attitude that a lot of people, I think, have around, local control and where it needs to be if we're going to address this housing crisis at scale. But I also want to say that it was, in a way, a middle ground on skirting local control. It said to communities, you have to zone for this new housing, but it gave them the leeway to overlay the zoning, in a way that again, they planned for. But the downside of that, of course, is that, we often see the zoning overlaid over existing housing or other properties that are very unlikely to be developed or redeveloped. So I think if we're going to find ways of tackling this housing crisis, without usurping local control, okay, let's look at permitting reform and state environmental reviews and building codes and other things. But if we're going to do zoning reform, in a way that makes, the maximum impact we need in order to bring vacancy rates to a healthy level and stabilize prices, it probably needs to be preemptive. And to be clear, MBTA Communities is still, at the end of the day, probably going to be the second most impactful, primarily market-driven housing production law in the state's history after Chapter 40B. But I think we're still in a situation where we've used a lot of state and local resources to implement a law that has, in some quarters at least, significantly drawn down the political bank account for housing reform. It's a step in the right direction. Some communities went above and beyond, but there are lessons to learn.
Yeah, actually, I'll add one more thing in response to that.
Yeah.
It's clear that our most effective housing production laws, like Andrew was saying, are Chapter 40B and the MBTA Communities Act, because both of these are getting at when we don't allow for housing development, state action is critical. And so both of those laws demonstrate that. One more takeaway from the MBTA Communities Act is, yes, we have the number of homes that are zoned for. We're actually seeing over 7,000 homes in the pipeline. And even more exciting is I'm hearing from affordable housing and mixed income developers, they are looking in communities they never considered before because there was no ability to build before. So Andrew and Jesse are right, a lot more to do, but that is definitely a sea change. And to hear that kind of response, I'm looking to build in places I never considered before, is really important.
I think the only other thing I'd add is that we also now have in almost every community or every MBTA community a group of housing advocates who
That's right.
organized and stepped up and learned how to do it. We also have a lot of bruises and other things from the process.
Thank you, Greg. That is one of the most important points, because we know from Katie's research that the dominant voice before has been no, no, no. And now there are a lot of voices saying yes. So you are correct. That is actually one of the greatest takeaways.
Great, thank you. Andrew, I want to start with you. Share with us one idea that could help grow housing. What's the next thing we should be looking at and looking towards Beacon Hill to help us do?
Right. I mean, I think, many people on this call already know, in addition to my day job at the Pioneer Institute, I'm the chair of a ballot committee called Legalized Starter Homes. That's trying to make it legal to build new single-family homes on smaller lots statewide in areas with public sewer and water services, so that we can have smaller homes, more affordable homes, and more homes. Because land is so expensive in much of Massachusetts, allowing homes on smaller lots will reduce the cost of homes for buyers and make it so that developers don't have to build, giant McMansions just to justify the cost of assembling so much land. So anyone who needs a small, low maintenance, relatively low cost home will benefit from this, especially young families, downsizing seniors, and first time home buyers of all ages. Massachusetts is the hardest state in the country for young adults to buy a home. Seniors in the suburbs especially are trapped in their homes because they don't have somewhere nearby to downsize. Small business owners have a hard time attracting and retaining employees because those employees can't find or afford a home nearby. This ballot question would address all of those issues. The new minimum lot size threshold in areas with public sewer and water service would be 5,000 square feet, about the size of an NBA basketball court. Our ballot question is currently in front of the legislature. If they kind of don't take action on it, it will come back to us for a second round of signature gathering before it's on the ballot this November. And I'm really excited about not only the potential to change laws here, but also the potential to change the conversation. Having direct voter input on zoning reform at the state level is very rare in this country. Also, I'm obligated to tell you that my day job employer, Pioneer Institute, is not involved with my campaign on an organizational level. I'm doing this in my personal capacity.
We're going to get to some of the Pioneers' ideas too, but let me just ask you, so you live in Wellesley. Help us understand what this law could mean in a community like Wellesley or other suburban communities that are part of the chamber footprint and next to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an incremental shift in how we're building housing, including in existing single family neighborhoods, that utilizes the infrastructure that's already there. Right. I hear, especially with single family development, a lot of fiscal concerns, a lot of school capacity concerns, but, a lot of traffic concerns. But this is, 4 or 6 or 8, single family subdivisions. So it's at a scale that allows a community to plan proactively to address some of the issues that happen with development. I think, a it's easy to kind of to see the impact of, dozens or hundreds of homes being proposed at a time on kind of the political environment in places like Wellesley. But, in the spirit of strong towns, the national advocacy group, the next increment of development should always be legal in, existing neighborhoods. And that's what I'm doing here.
So, and just someone had wrote in the comments that they wish there was more effort to create single family homes. There's still a need for that. This does that. I'm just wondering, Jesse and Rachel, before we move on to your ideas, what do you think about this idea?
Yeah, so my organization, Abundant Housing Massachusetts, is strongly in support of the Legalized Starter Homes campaign for all the reasons that Andrew explained. I think it's a good idea. We also are trying to tackle lot size reform through legislation as well, which we can talk about in a minute. I think multiple strategies to address this will be really critical to help achieve some progress. But I think for the reasons Andrew laid out, it's absolutely critical. And I think it is monumental to have it potentially going before the voters in November. We've done, as Andrew alluded to, some research as to how this has gone, or have other states done this, and it is quite unprecedented. So we like to lead here in Massachusetts, and potentially we have the opportunity to lead and show giving voters the opportunity to vote on this issue can lead to lasting and impactful outcomes. So yeah, we support this and support the reform of lot sizes in any way possible in the state.
And Rachel, what do you think about the starter homes?
CHAPA hasn't taken a position on ballot questions yet, but this policy is very much in line with legislation we've worked on. And I think it's important for people to know, when we look around our communities now, the homes we see most often cannot be rebuilt under our current zoning. So we have really increased lot size requirements that are not in line with what the development patterns have been. And so sometimes there can be a disconnect when you see this kind of housing in your neighborhood. And so you think it's possible, but if that home were to be taken down, it couldn't be replaced. So these reforms are very important for ensuring that we can continue to create more modest sized homes that a lot of people are looking for that simply can't be built today.
Well, and again, this ballot question would allow for smaller homes to be built in many of our communities, and that could be significant. So, Jesse, talk to us about lot size, if you could, or what kinds of things abundant housing is looking at. Give us one idea.
Yeah, so there's a major piece of legislation that we've been working on this session, in partnership with CHAPA and others, an act to promote Yes in My Backyard. I know we're going to hear from Senator Brownsberger in a minute. I want to thank him and his colleague, Senator Chairman Sear, and the Joint Committee on Housing, and the rest of the Senate members on that committee for pushing that bill forward, reporting out favorably, combining it with some other really important legislation I think Rachel will talk about. At its core, Yes in My Backyard, the Act to Promote Yes in My Backyard, is an attempt to do what we were talking about earlier, which is recognize the important progress we've made under the MBTA Communities Act, but also recognize that it, in and of itself, is not going to lead to the 222,000 or more homes that we need in the state in the next 10 years. And combine that with the really important work we did in the legislature did in the last legislative session to legalize accessory dwelling units in most residential land throughout the state of Massachusetts. That alone, and those two bills combined, won't get us to the 222,000 homes that we need to build. So there are other strategies that we need to undertake to make sure that we are using zoning as a tool, as Rachel said earlier, to say yes to more housing in our communities, and to break down the barriers, or some of the ways that it's been used as a barrier to prevent the production of more affordable homes in more places. So as we talked about lot size reform, that's one element that's combined in the YIMBY bill. Our approach under the YIMBY bill is to eliminate minimum lot sizes in Massachusetts. You still need to have enough land to build, standard, housing that meets building code and sanitary standards. But it will address the high cost that land has in the construction of new housing. And this would address not just single family housing, but that would be a key impact, helping to facilitate new starter homes. But we'll also address the ability to build, sort of smaller apartment buildings, 3-deckers, townhomes, things like that, which are harder and more costly to build with larger sized land. So that's one thing we're trying to do. And in addition to that, we have a component in that bill that would legalize the splitting of larger lots into smaller lots for residential use as of right. So without having to go through a discretionary approval process that gives some of the more NIMBY-oriented neighbors the opportunity to say no, recognizing that housing is a critical benefit to our communities. It's something that we greatly need. And so if you have a very large lot, you can split it into a smaller lot to build smaller homes. So that's another important piece of it. The second piece I just wanted to mention, or do you want me to pause there, Greg?
Yeah, give us a second one and then we'll move on.
Another really important piece that I wanted to mention is the impact of parking on new development. We are vastly overbuilding parking throughout Greater Boston. There's been some really important research the Metropolitan Area Planning Council did that said the arbitrary parking ratios that we're applying to new development result in parking being built that is costly, that adds to the cost of building new homes, but is underutilized by the ultimate owners or tenants of that housing. So under the Act to Promote Yes in My Backyard, we are talking about statewide reform of costly parking mandates. Adding a new parking space per unit can cost $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 or more, particularly as you get to some of the more expensive forms of parking like underground. And we think that it is unnecessary. It drives up the cost of housing. It makes housing less affordable and actually dissuades builders often from building housing in some communities. So we want to decouple parking from new development. Sorry, go ahead, Greg.
Hey, Rachel, give us an idea.
I have so many, but thankfully Jesse was able to cover the YIMBY bill, which, as he noted, we are equal partners on. And another bill that we are working on is Yes in God's Backyard. So we have Yes in My Backyard, Yes in God's Backyard. Notice the theme of yes. So Yes in God's Backyard is, it would allow multifamily development on all properties owned by faith-based organizations. What's really important about this is just noting the potential for development. We need to get to 222,000 homes over the next 10 years, which we keep talking about. At CHAPA, we believe it needs to be a mix of affordable, deeply affordable, market rate. It all needs to be included in there. How are we going to get there? We need communities to allow development, and we need more action at the state level. When we look at who owns land, we have a lot of state-owned land, and we see through the Affordable Homes Act that there's state-owned land being made available for housing development, including a parcel in Wellesley. And then we look at faith-based organizations. This is another big landowner in the state. So just the potential to create housing, knowing that we have land in every single community. There's actually over 10.7 million acres that are owned by faith-based organizations. And what could happen if, everything, we know zoning is just zoning, it's allowing for it. If it were completely built out, that could be 500,000 new homes. It could be 100,000 affordable homes, because the way the legislation is written, it allows for 30 to 50 units per acre, with 20% being affordable, really kind of mirroring the way Chapter 40B homes are created. Another important aspect of the YIMBY legislation is that properties that are currently not on the tax rolls would be brought onto the tax rolls. This is really important for our communities who are looking for more revenue. And so one way to do that is more housing development, particularly on parcels that are not currently taxed. So we think this proposal is a really strong proposal. There's a lot of support for it. And it's really a win-win, a win for more homes that people, our communities, our businesses need, and a win for local revenue.
And I guess also a win for the faith-based organization that might be looking
Absolutely.
for the revenue stream. And we know many of them struggle these days without, to upgrade their own facilities or whatever they need to do it. Thank you for that. All right, Andrew, is there anything particular Pioneers focused on that you want to share with us?
Yeah, so a lot of the reforms we've covered so far are really around zoning. And I think, zoning is necessary and important because it's what you can build and where. But the process-based reforms are also really important and something Pioneer has focused a lot on in the last year. In no small part because a lot of the zoning reforms we have done, including MBTA communities in Massachusetts, have generated some controversy and generated lawsuits. And, I'm concerned that there might be some zoning fatigue on Beacon Hill headed into 2026. So I view process-based reforms as an opportunity to accelerate housing production while avoiding much of the controversy around undermining local control over zoning. And that's because so many of the guardrails around local permitting processes are already controlled at the state level, right? We should go further than the Baker administration did in, I think, 2021, and only require a simple majority vote for every special permit and rezoning that facilitates new housing development. Right now, there are a few carve-outs from the default supermajority vote threshold in the statute, but still way too many situations where you need 4 out of 5 planning board members to say yes to a project for it to move forward. It really should be 3 on a 5-person board. And of course, by the same token, it means nothing if it's easier to approve housing at the local level if the neighbors can just turn around, sue the developer or sue the approval body, and hold the project up in court for years. So we also need to continue to make changes to the legal appeals process for local land use decisions. The Affordable Homes Act of 2024 did some of that, giving judges discretion to have bond requirements that deter nuisance lawsuits, for example. But we can go further, right? Require by statute a narrow technical rationale for the appeal. It needs to be, my property is going to flood, and here's a third-party engineer who can verify that, and not just, I don't like the density, I'm worried about my property values, etc. Lastly, specialty courts like Land Court and the Housing Appeals Committee, which handles appeals under Chapter 40B, their judges already have expertise on land use issues and thus tend to render decisions faster. So they need more resources, and both plaintiffs and appellants should be able to move their cases to land court upon request.
Thank you. Rachel and Jesse, you want to either expand on that or add any other ideas on the table before we bring in Senator Brownsberger?
I'd love to expand on that. First of all, Andrew is right. Right now is the time where we need to pull on every state and local lever to actually move housing production forward more quickly. It should not take 5, 10, 15 years to build the homes that we know we need today. An important bill that we are working on is around site plan review. So when zoning is put in place, it should be a fairly straightforward process for a developer to actually build within the zoning. Right now, site plan review, which is something that we do in our communities, is not defined in state law. We are working to define it, to set timeframes around it, and to make it clear for both municipalities and developers what can be decided through this process and what has already been decided through zoning. What is administrative and what needs a public comment? By making this clearer, this could really help things move forward. I've certainly seen developments that are taking well over a year to get through the site plan review process. And in that time, prices are going up on everything. And that means more time, that means more money, that means more expensive housing. So this is one of those process reforms that can make a really big difference.
And I would add along the lines of zoning, it's not just all zoning, and I absolutely agree, although, I think we're all in agreement of there is more zoning reform that needs to happen, but there are other aspects that influence our ability to build the homes that Massachusetts residents need, whether it's permitting reform or building code. And one of the items that we're trying to tackle through building code this year is the requirement that every residential building over 3 stories has 2 staircases or 2 means of egress. This is something that over the last 50 years, has taken root in Massachusetts and other places around the country, and I think addresses the fact that historically the types of homes that we built, look at the triple decker that is throughout all of our communities that was built with, there's just tinder boxes waiting to go up. But that's not the way we build housing anymore. Modern construction methods are safer. They have fire rating, pressurized doors, other things to prevent fires. And this movement has emerged across the country to reform state building codes to allow single stair residential buildings up to 6 stories. So if you're building up to a 6-story apartment building or any form of housing, you would only have to build 1 staircase. There was a great report that just earlier this month came out of the state of Minnesota that said these single stair residential buildings are actually safer than the larger double-loaded corridor buildings, essentially because every apartment is closer to a staircase in a single-stair residential building than in these larger footprint buildings that modern building code requires us to build. So we have been advocating for a bill that has also been reported out favorably by both the Senate and House side of the Joint Committee on Housing to create a commission to study a building code change in Massachusetts that would legalize these six-story that would legalize residential buildings with a single staircase up to 6 stories. The Boston Indicators, a lot of shout outs to them today, did a great study last year looking at if we legalized single stair residential buildings up to 6 stories, just in Boston and the communities that touch Boston, that would unlock the potential for up to 130,000 homes on lots that currently are difficult, if not impossible, to build on because of the requirement for 2 staircases that pushes this larger double-loaded corridor-style building that doesn't fit in a lot of our non-conforming lots throughout the region. So huge potential impact there. The law itself wouldn't force the building code change. We think it's really important to bring fire officials, building code officials, others together to study like Minnesota and other states have done. But in this case, Massachusetts wouldn't be a leader. A number of other states and jurisdictions around the country have already done it. And so I think it could be hugely impactful here. If you multiply the 130,000 potential new homes just in greater Boston to all the other cities and regions around the state that have these older, smaller, non-conforming lots. So I think single-stair residential buildings is another item I would love to push.
Excellent, thank you. And before we put Senator Brownsberger on the spot and ask him about all these things, I did want to ask each of you, especially Rachel and Jesse, if folks want to join your team or get engaged in this issue, the kinds of things you're talking about, tell us how they can get engaged in that. Give us, you put some stuff in the chat too, links, but just tell us, Rachel, about the kinds of things that happen through CHAPA.
Sure. One of the easiest ways to get involved with us is joining Our Massachusetts. It is a coalition that we have set up that is cross-sector. It makes it easy for people to engage in housing advocacy in their communities. Greg is one of our co-chairs, and I'll put the link in the chat, but go ahead and sign up. We can provide all the kinds of fact sheets and talking points that you need to help you engage in your community. I'll also put a link to CHAPA's website so that if you're interested in getting more involved, I see some people on the Zoom today that are very active in our policy committees. If you want to help shape any of the housing policies that we're working on, I'll put a link in the chat for that as well. Oh, thank you, Max. Max is already on top of it. If you go to chapa.org and go under engage, you'll see the different policy committees that we have.
Great, and Jesse?
Yeah, for Abundant Housing Massachusetts, you can visit our website, abundanthousingma.org. As we are talking a lot about, zoning reform and other policies we want to pass at the state level on Beacon Hill, we recognize that the major impact in the immediate term on, reforming land use, reforming zoning will happen on the local level. In fact, that's what's been happening through the MBTA Communities Act. So Abundant Housing Massachusetts, or AMA, we're focused on supporting and building up a base of grassroots pro-housing advocates and communities around the state. We have about 24 affiliate organizations, mostly grassroots, volunteer, resident-led organizations. I see a number of our members also on the call here. We're always trying to build out more of these grassroots pro-housing or local YIMBY groups. We have a team of organizers who are prepared to help folks do that. So you can learn more at abundanthousingma.org or follow us on social media, various handles, but you can find all of those on our website.
And I just want to note that Pioneer does a lot of important research and reports on this. And Andrew, maybe you could just put the URL in so people can sign up to get the research reports that you do and anything else you think. So we're going to move on though. Senator Brownsberger, thank you so much for being part of this program today. Senator Brownsberger represents Watertown, Belmont, and part of Boston. He's a member of the Joint Committee on Housing. He's also the guy who literally walked the housing choice bill across the finish line when it was passed. And now, was it 2 years ago? Last year? 2 years ago. And Senator, we really appreciate that you're here with us today. And I'd like to start by asking you, what did you hear this morning that you liked? What did you hear this morning that you didn't like?
I'm not sure I heard anything I didn't like. I mean, I want to say, first of all, to you and the Charles River Chamber, thank you for your leadership. You've been communicating about the need to build housing consistently, year in and year out now, and just doing a great job of lifting it up and building the community movement to support housing. And in assembling this panel, it's been a great panel. The research that we saw was illuminating, interesting about the consistency of not engaging in the single family zoning, and the sort of mix of results. Through the MBTA Communities Act. And then, the advocates you have here are the leading advocates for housing, and, Rachel Heller's voice and Jesse's voice and Andrew's voice. The ideas that they've been putting on the table are ideas that we've been listening carefully to consistently for many years now, and right now. So I think we have been successful in building and increasing movement for more housing across the state. I think there's a huge recognition within the legislative body, and both branches, but I can speak for the Senate. I was in a meeting with the Senate president and a group of leaders, just maybe it was the last September, the September before. Senate president looked around and said, let's just go around the table and everybody share what they perceive their top issue. And as we went around the table, it was everybody just was housing. Everybody's got it, that that is the key perceived and real affordability issue right now. And so the Senate definitely wants to be bold, to do big things, and continue to move the needle forward. We recognize that what has been done so far is not enough to achieve the goals that we've articulated for ourselves. And I do believe those are good goals, the couple 100,000 units in the next 10 years. I mean, basically a rate of 20,000+ per year. That's where we'd like to be. That's not where we have been. We have been at that point in the past. There's nothing physically impossible about that. It really does reflect the sort of the zoning we've created. And I mean, the low rate of production really reflects the zoning that we've created and all those sort of procedural steps that are involved in building things, which slow things down, and time is money, and uncertainty is money. And so those are discouraging to development. So the major legislation, the permitting legislation, the YIMBY legislation, all those pieces are things that we moved out of the Housing Committee because we want to be as bold as possible. That goes as so far as to include multifamily zoning by right across the state. And it also includes dozens of more modest reforms especially on the permitting side. The stuff that Andrew was inventorying about streamlining site plan review and also the appeals process. All of those ideas are on the table right now. We're now at the process of saying, okay, what can we go forward with in this session? And so that's the question that the Senate is wrestling with right now, and I'm hopeful we'll get to an answer. I'm sure we'll come out with something good. I'll just make a personal statement of perspective on it. I think that I do feel that we have put communities through a lot over the past few years with the MBTA zoning, and so I think it would land with a thud if we then basically completely sort of vitiated that by passing a much more aggressive statewide zoning plan. I think that may be a bridge too far. What aggressive means, that's the question. I mean, how far can we go? But I think we have to be sensitive to the fact that a lot of communities have gone through a political process, and that having gone through that, our intervention may be perceived as overreaching. I think we probably have to live into it for another year or two before we take further aggressive statewide zoning for multifamily.
Let me stop you right there, Senator, if I could. I would love to hear Jesse, Rachel, and Andrew what you think about that notion that we've already done too much. We can't ask for something that significant again right now.
Not quite fair enough.
Well, first, thank you, Senator. You've been an excellent partner and very appreciative of your leadership on housing. I know that there is concern that you're articulating about putting communities through the exercise of doing all these votes again and creating districts. There's a few things about just zoning. While we may have zoning fatigue, zoning, as Jesse was saying earlier, I think it was Andrew, determines what gets built, what doesn't get built, and that translates into who can live there and who can't live there. And we need to keep working on that because you can't build what's not allowed. That being said, there are ways to do it, as we saw with the Affordable Homes Act, which Senator Brownsberger was a leader on, around accessory dwelling units. You know, Jesse was talking about 3 and 5 stories by right, the triple deckers that we see in our communities today, allowing those to be built by right. These are things that, you know, the legislature can do. YIGBY, the Yes in God's Backyard, we know where faith-based organizations are. These aren't entire districts. It wouldn't compel a local vote saying these are areas we're going to allow development. So I think there's a balance we can strike here that doesn't have everybody going through a planning exercise, even though it's incredibly helpful. And there's ways to get there, but we've got to keep working on the zoning because you can't build, it's not allowed.
Jesse and Andrew, say something, and then we'll let-
Also want to, thank the senator for his partnership and leadership on these issues. And I hear what he's saying in terms of some of the fatigue around MBTA communities. Certainly some of that has to do with how we designed it, that, unlike in other states that have taken a much more preemptive approach to zoning reform, we did say we're going to, require these, rather intensive conversations around rezoning for good reason, I believe. But, I think that's what led us to this point. Rachel, mentioned the ADU component of the Affordable Homes Act that was passed last year. I think that is an important precedent here in this conversation, because unlike the MBTA Communities Act, it didn't actually require every community to go through an affirmative process of adopting zoning that complied with the state law. Some have done it. Newton has exceeded the requirements under the law, which is great. But it doesn't actually require that level of conversation. And while there's a lot of fear, I think, maybe somewhat among legislators, but certainly among constituents, that the sky would be falling if we legalize ADUs and we're losing single family exclusive neighborhoods. That hasn't quite happened yet. In fact, we're at a point where we're trying to say, like, how do we actually get more ADUs to be built under the law that we passed? And so just to say that a little bit more preemptive or prescriptive approach on Beacon Hill actually hasn't led to the sky falling when it comes to ADUs, and hasn't actually led to the same level of confrontation, even in some communities, that MBTA communities did. So I think we can do some of these other reform, lot size, parking, missing middle housing in ways like that as well.
Andrew, do you want to jump in here?
Of course, yeah. And that's, to Jesse's point, that's why we focus on, family-oriented housing. That's why we don't require, communities to rezone themselves, et cetera, because we have, reforms in the pipeline that are incremental, but cover a broad scope. And I think that MBTA communities felt like the opposite to a lot of people, because it was narrowly focused on transit-oriented, and a lot of people didn't know what 15 units an acre was. And that's also why, I think I emphasized the permitting reforms earlier as well, because so much of that feels less tangible to people. Like, it's easy to imagine, we've all seen the yard signs in Wayland and Weston of like buildings with vampire teeth and things like that when a project is proposed. But I think that making the case that these process-based reforms are expediting the process of building the housing that is desirable is really important. But of course, I don't want to de-emphasize the role of zoning either, because fundamentally the math is what it is, and that we need 222,000 plus units of housing in the next 10 years. And it's a trade-off between what the politics are at the hyper-local level and what the regional needs are at the end of the day.
Senator, floor is yours.
Thank you. No, look, I agree with the point that it's an interesting thought. Okay, we did MBTA zoning in a way that forced everybody to do a whole lot of work, and maybe people would have been less. The pushback would have been less if we just done it and just zoned up multifamily, if not everywhere, that just zoned up multifamily within 1,000 feet of a T station. That's just not. It's not what we did. But had we done it, maybe that might have produced a lot more housing. the reservation I have is that having put people through that, if we sort of radically override that with something from the state right after they're finished, I think we'd get some pushback. And I do think we have to bear in mind this, that the legislature's power is finite, that just as a local proposal can be overturned at the ballot, so can anything we do. So we have to, there's a difficult judgment call to make as to how much, how far to go at any given moment, because we have to respect the will of the voters because it's a real thing. It's not an idea, it's a real reality that we have to work with. So I for making as much progress as we can. That's the judgment call we're struggling with is, how much work can we do on the zoning front? I'm very gung-ho on everything on the permitting side. I think that's where, I think the resistance is likely to be less, and the progress can nonetheless be very meaningful. So but again, that's just me talking about, how I see the lay of the land. I am 100% gung-ho to do all of this. The question is just how much can we get done without over.
Great. I appreciate that, and we're going to open the floor to questions and comments. Max Wolf, I'll ask you to read some of the comments we have, but also you can raise your hand if you want to speak. One last question for you, Senator, and I want to note that Representative Tarski from Needham and Representative Owens are both here from Watertown, and if they want to chime in, they should do so as well. So, Senator, there's a big bill in front that seems to be progressing through the Senate, and your leadership has made it, as leadership, you made it really clear this is a priority to do something this year big. I think we all know that sometimes that means the House is less enthusiastic about anything. It seems to be that kind of, at least the perception that the two bodies will set different priorities. What do you think? Help us handicap. How do we really think it goes next?
Well, first of all, the Senate, if you're addressing that to me, I mean, first of all, it's got to go through this. And that's where, I have more influence and more judgment about what's going to happen. I expect us to do something bold. I want us to go as far as we can, and we'll see what we can do. As to the House, look, I mean, they passed MBTA zoning too, and I'm not going to judge them as anything other than, full partners in the process. We work together.
Right. Okay. Thank you. All right, we're going to open the floor to comments. If you would like to jump in, raise your hand, and we'll bring you into the conversation. And Max, you can also read some of the questions we have in the comment section as we see them. So maybe you want to start, Max, if you see something there, while we're waiting for folks to raise their hand.
Okay, we have one hand raised, so I'm going to go to Josephine.
Why don't you have a question to read first?
Yeah, I do have one. I'll just summarize it. It was on the construction side. We've been talking a lot about zoning and permitting. What is the legislature considering on construction loans and make it easier to build housing right now? As we know, so many developments are stalled right now. They've gone through the permitting, they've gone through the zoning, they just can't finance. Put that question to the advocates probably first.
Would you like me to get started? There's an important new program that was created out of the Affordable Homes Act, the Momentum Fund, which is about helping to close those gaps and move forward these mixed income developments. So that is exciting to see that program up and running. Also in the Affordable Homes Act, there was a lot in there. That was the housing bond bill. So it provides financing for affordable housing development. There's a lot more for homeownership, which is exciting. The Commonwealth Builder Program, the new homeownership production tax credit, both of which are being run out of mass housing. These are creating new homeownership opportunities. So we've got both the Momentum Fund helping to move rental developments forward, and then a lot of investment in homeownership. And then on the demand side, more money for down payment assistance and helping people to actually compete in the market right now.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Well, let me just comment on that. Thank you, Rachel, for identifying those two things and referring them back to the bond bill. We have put huge money behind building housing. The affordable housing funding, it works out to, it's billions over the next few years. But the important thing to remember, and it does work out, it's about $1 billion a year, really, between the federal tax credit, the state tax credit, low-income housing tax credit, and our bond money. The important thing to remember, though, is that ultimately that is going to we have enough money to assist in maybe 2,000 or 3,000 units a year. That's the scale of the state's, housing capital investments. And we have to bear that in mind because the total scale that we're trying to achieve is 20,000 something. And that's not going to come from more state money. That's going to come from developers feeling that they can move projects forward across the state and do it expeditiously. And we need to make the state as attractive as possible for private capital investment. Otherwise, we can't move the needle.
Great. Okay. One of the note that Katie from BU has joined us in case you have questions about MBTA communities and the data we've looked at. Josephine McNeil, welcome from Candid.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for this informative and interesting discussion. So I'm going to ask something that's very, very basic and probably too simplistic for this august panel, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Those who know me know I'm not shy about asking questions. As I'm listening to this, and based on my experience in Newton, we have these various organizations. SHAPRA is really the only one that I really know anything about. But I'd like to know, where are the voices of low-income people? And especially as we're talking about housing, my focus has been for the last 40 years on low-income renters. And the shift from when I first started has moved from low-income people to middle-income people and upper-middle-income people. And yet at the same time, we talk about housing that we need. But in some communities, and some of the communities that have not been in favor of more housing, don't, in my opinion, there's no opportunity or voice to listen to and hear the folks, low-income people. And it would seem to me that if there was some effort made to really engage low-income renters, that some of the things that we want to do might actually happen, because there are people who are saying that we need housing. We keep talking about these big numbers. And I think for most people, when you talk about 222,000 units, that just seems like something that is just beyond people's comprehension. So I guess
Josephine, I'm gonna stop you there. I'd love to hear what people think about that.
Yeah, I'd love to weigh in, Greg. Hi, Josephine. Josephine's a longtime member of CHAPA and someone I've worked with for a long time, and appreciate very much all of your work, Josephine. So at CHAPA, within this 222,000 homes that we need over the next 10 years, we think it is critical that we focus on the affordability and deep affordability within that. As we grow the Commonwealth's housing stock, we need to grow for all. And adding supply definitely does help everyone. However, there is such a gap for people with low incomes and extremely low incomes that we need to do more. We need to invest dollars. So just to think about 222,000 homes, CHAPA is working to make sure that 20% of those are affordable at a moderate income. Think your inclusionary zoning, think Chapter 40B, really for your municipal employees, people, in that income range. And that 10% of the homes need to be deeply affordable for people with extremely low incomes. Half of that should actually be supportive housing. We see homelessness increasing. We know that some people experiencing homelessness need services as well as housing. This is the hardest kind of housing to build, whether in neighborhood opposition or funding. So there's all of these challenges, right? We need to make sure that we're growing for everyone. We at CHAPA are working on public housing, ensuring that we can preserve our public housing stock, expand. We've seen redevelopment efforts in Somerville and Charlestown. These need to happen. And often when you're doing redevelopment, you can create mixed income housing to really support the deeply affordable housing and even expand that deeply affordable housing. In my town, where Senator Brownsberger lives as well, we are expanding public housing. So we've got that. Rental assistance. Massachusetts actually created rental assistance programs before there was Section 8. The Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program was the model. And we have a great program here. It's grown to $290 million. We are working with people experiencing homelessness, experiencing housing instability to grow that program. It is the program that enables us to bring rents down to levels that people with extremely low incomes can afford. And finally, we're working with a lot of supportive housing providers on expanding our supportive housing and preserving our supportive housing in the state. So some of that is through tools that were created through the Affordable Homes Act, like implementing a new flex pool to help build that housing. And some of it is the rental assistance and just making it easier to provide supportive services in these developments as well. So there's a lot on that. I can put my contact info in the chat. You can reach out to me if you want to get involved on the affordable and deeply affordable side.
Senator Bransberger, do you want to weigh in on this? And then we're going to go to Newton City Councilor Susan Albright, who has her hand raised.
Yeah, look, I mean, the supportive housing is key, and we have a set of programs that really are targeted at the extremely low income group, those making less than 30% of the area median income, typically, elderly, often sometimes disabled. And then we also have the various inclusionary programs, that are, available to people making maybe 80, 100% of the median income. What we lack, and I really think this is something we all have to just keep contemplating, is any structure that reaches people in the sort of 50% of median income, 30 to 50% of median income. The folks that are baristas, home healthcare workers, childcare workers, laborers, that are making something not too far above the minimum wage. There's no housing program that we're doing that really targets that sector. And that's kind of a function to some extent of the federal definitions. It's hard, it's worth remembering that 80% of the subsidy in this state still does come from the federal government. So we're heavily influenced by those federal program parameters. So that's one of the things I'm worried most about is how do we create housing for that group? And in that group, it's all about the just building more housing in the hope that there'll be a shifting that allows housing to reach that income group.
Thank you. City Councilor Susan Albright. Thanks for joining us this morning, Councilor.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, for this panel. It's been a great panel. And thank you for the answer to Josephine's question. I really appreciated the answers. I'm wondering, perhaps Senator Brownsberger or any of you, that I understand that part of the possible bill that could get reported out has to do with making it easier to build like fourplexes on single family lots. And I'm wondering, and of course the minimum lot size would be an important aspect of that as well. I'm wondering what the opportunities are to get that bill out of the Senate and the House and actually passed, because I think the research that we heard about first showed that most communities were avoiding single family housing. So this could really make a difference. I do have one other part of this question, which is we would love to see in Newton more home ownership, more condominiums, and not just for low income people, but for all incomes. And we understand that banks will not finance projects larger than, 28 units as condominiums. How do we get the banks to come around and allow more home ownership in their financing?
I wonder, Andrew, if you have done some research looking at this.
Honestly, not exactly. I mean, I think we've seen that, I've done some research on finance for ADUs in particular, but in larger buildings, I'll confirm, it is harder to finance, home ownership at that scale than rental. But in terms of, getting the private sector to do things it otherwise wouldn't, that's not exactly Pioneer's wheelhouse.
Okay.
I'd love to address the first part of the councilor's question. So within the YIMBY bill, as reported, as originally introduced and reported favorably by the Senate, there is a component that would legalize up to 5 units as of right on residential land throughout the state, 5 units if connected to municipal or public water and sewer, or up to 3 units if not, and on septic. And this is actually reflecting something that some of our neighbors in New England, Vermont, and Maine have already done, legalizing 2 to 4 units as of right throughout those states, and was a recommendation of the Unlocking Housing Production Commission that I had the opportunity to serve on at the behest of the governor last year. So that's what the component of that bill is. Again, in a place like Newton that has, public utilities, sewer, it would allow up to 5 units to be built as of right. That bill has on the Senate side been reported out favorably and amended by the Senate. Grateful for, again, Senator Brownsberger, Chairman Sear and others for pushing that forward. It is at Ways and Means now, and I think as part of those discussions that Senator Brownsberger alluded to on the Senate side. On the House, that bill is still sitting in the Joint Committee on Housing. And so I would definitely encourage folks to reach out to their state reps and say that this bill and that component of this bill is important and that you would like to see the Joint Committee on Housing, the House side of Joint Committee on Housing, report out the YIMBY bill. So it's part of the conversation moving forward in the House.
Max, I'm going to ask you if you have a written question, and I'm going to ask everybody to try to keep their answers short so we can get as many people in as possible in the final few minutes of this morning. Max?
Yeah, so we have a question from Jackie in the chat that says, how do you interpret pushback in the will of the voter and balancing what is best for the majority? And I think this goes to Katie's presentation about ballot referendums, and at the local level, are they democratic and are they a good way to deal with housing? I wonder your analysis there. And then to Senator Brownsberger, you mentioned, worried about going too far and on the state level ballot referendums as well. I'm wondering what your opinion on putting housing on the ballot is on the state level. So let's go to Katie and then Senator Brownsberger.
Sure. So I'll pick up that question about sort of what does it mean for something to be democratic, which sort of feels like a very big question to tackle in this forum. But what I will say, when we think about things like ballot referendum or town meeting, I think a lot of times things that seem good on paper and very sort of small d democratic in practice often act as forums for small groups of folks who are advantaged on a variety of different dimensions to dominate the proceedings. So taking the case of ballot referendum, these are very off-cycle elections. And we know that off-cycle election participants tend to be older, whiter, way more likely to be homeowners than the general population. They're also low turnout affairs. And so I think it would be a mistake to say that a ballot referendum necessarily tells us what the majority of people in a community think about housing. What it tells me is what a set of voters who is willing to show up on a December Tuesday thinks about housing. And that's, certainly an important and very consequential population, but I don't think it would be fair to say that that is sort of the most democratic way to make policy decisions. Sort of my own take is we should have robust local elections and local democracy, and then we should have those politicians be able to make decisions and not have these kinds of off-cycle referendum shaping decisions. That would be the sort of most democratic outcome.
If I can briefly add, sorry.
We'll go to Senator Brownsberger first on the statewide ballot referendums.
Yeah, I mean, it's a deep philosophical question. I mean, as a legislator, I really do believe in representative government, and I tend to believe in the process we go through as a way of really deeply vetting the consequences of things. It's hard for, that's why we have representative government. It's hard for voters to evaluate the complex impact of proposals. However, we have to think of the referendum process as a given, as a part of our political landscape. There is no prospect whatsoever that we're going to take that away. And at the state level, that is not an off-cycle election. If we do something that overreaches, that will be on a November ballot with a maximal turnout, and the results will be what they are as the result of people's the messages that people are exposed to and people's underlying feelings about the proposal, whatever we've done. So we just have to take that as a given. That's part of the reality we deal with, whether we like it philosophically or not. It's a given.
Great. Jesse, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, just briefly, to the points that Professor Einstein was making in terms of some of these processes not being representative. We commissioned as Abundant Housing Massachusetts a statewide poll of voters last year, asking about their attitudes on housing. We found, and this was about a statistically valid sample of 800 voters across the state of Massachusetts in every region. 81% of them, this was after the passage of the Affordable Homes Act, 81% of them supported legislation additional legislation to make it easier to build more housing and offer a greater variety of home types across the Commonwealth. 71% of voters said that they support building more homes that people can afford over protecting their traditional neighborhood character. And 63% said building more homes and bringing down costs is more important than preserving local control over the type of housing that gets built. And so certainly that is not reflective of some of these conversations we've had, whether around MBTA communities, referenda, and other just difficult conversations around housing production in our state.
Thank you. Jackie, I see you had your hand raised, and it was your question. Did you want to comment before we move on to the next question?
Yes, thank you so much. I would. I think one of the barriers, to be quite honest, that we're not talking about is exactly this, that people that have the power to move things forward are holding themselves back and supposedly not acting upon their own values and their own moral judgment about what is best, but assessing the public support or pushback as a way to decide whether you're going to push something forward. And building on what Jesse said and what we're seeing, I would say the vast majority of people in Watertown did not see the MBTA process as a burden. You might have heard more from people who saw it that way, but most of us saw it as an opportunity to do exactly what we need and more. And the fact that people on planning boards and zoning boards and representatives and senators hold themselves back because of how they're viewing the pushback is really unfair and really detrimental to what supposedly we are all standing for in theory. So I really
thank you, Jackie. We're going to go to Rachel, and then we'll go to Lynn Sweet after that.
I think you're hitting on a really important point, Jackie. It's actually all about us all turning out more to be the voice of yes, to create that environment where our policymakers know that there are people in the community that are supporting them and moving forward. Katie has documented so well what these meetings are like at the local level. And I've worked in the state house, I've gotten the calls of people who are worried about development coming. It is incumbent upon all of us, and you all bring a wealth of experience, whether you're a business owner, whether you're a housing developer, whether you have needed housing or it's been a part of your life experience. You all have expertise. We need to change the narrative. It is critical that we do that because we are in a position where it's been no, no, no our entire lives. And we need to start saying yes, because that means I have the option to stay in the community I've loved. It means that a renter can become a homeowner. It means that a grandparent can live near their grandkids. We have to remind people what this is all about. So I would put that all on all of us to keep showing up and saying yes.
Lynn Sweet, you're next.
Oh, thank you very much. I kind of have more statements touching on a couple of areas and a few questions in there. So I think we have a staffing issue at the state level with regard to getting affordable units through the state at your LAU applications, your 40B applications, your funding applications. And I think that there's fatigue and they need support. And I sort of feel the same way about, planning departments. They're getting hit with all these different legislations, and they have many, many different constituents that they have to address. And I don't, know how to change that, but I think that everyone should be aware of that. And really the question that I have, and I'm trying to work on 40Ys, which was part of the Affordable Homes Act, and I'm running into resistance. Planners want to add in more regulations. It hasn't, the actual guidelines have not actually been adopted. This is several years in the making. It's just another argument for communities to push back on, which is, well, we don't really know what it is because the guidelines aren't out. So I just think we've got capacity issues that I don't think it's a lack of will or want, it's a lack of time. So I don't know how to change that, but I know there's a lot of smart minds in the room, and I just wanted to throw that out.
Great, thank you. Anybody on the panel want to weigh in?
I'm happy to weigh in. I think that what I've heard from the state is that they, put 40Y down the priority list of implementation, in part because of MBTA communities and how litigious a lot of communities were on that. So they had more of a stake in addressing MBTA communities up front. But I do think that the net effect of that is, again, we're not focusing on family-oriented housing, or what I would call more likely to be family-oriented housing, nearly as much as we should be. And it comes to this question of, are the incentives, giving communities incentives to adopt this kind of zoning enough, or will we have to do something more preemptive? Lynn, you're shaking your head, but it's a question, not a statement.
Rachel?
I just wanted to respond to that I'm in the communities I'm working in, it's not feeling like the financial incentives are enough. The naysayers are just so vocal that it's really hard for local officials to do what I think they really truly want to do, which is to bring in these starter homes.
In terms of the state capacity that Lynn is talking about, it's definitely more than MBTA Communities Act. The legislature passed a really amazing bill, the Affordable Homes Act, that included, I think, 49 or 50 housing policies, all of which needed to be implemented. It's also important to note that under the Healy-Driscoll administration, housing went from being a department of housing and community development underneath the Executive Office of Economic Development to be its own secretariat. And we do need to support its growth. If housing is the #1 issue in our state, and it's holding us back from economic growth and from quality of life and people being able to stay here, we need to invest more in that agency and allow for them to grow, to support all of these efforts that are happening at the local level. We don't have a state office of planning. That falls all under housing and livable communities. And so as we all need more support, they need more staffing.
Thank you for that, and thank you, everybody. We're going to give everybody on the panel one last chance to ask any last final thoughts. My thanks to Needham Bank, and Suso, and our other sponsors, and to everybody who showed up today. I wish we could all be in person so we can continue this conversation once the event's over, but we will do that. We'll keep doing it here at the Chamber. We'll keep doing it with all of you, and we're grateful to our panelists for being part of it. So who wants to take us out with any last thoughts?
I will. Could, or Senator Brownsberger, go ahead.
After you, Rachel.
I would just say be a housing ambassador. Say yes to housing everywhere. Talk to your neighbors. Talk to your friends. Talk to your family. Talk to your local elected officials. Say yes.
There you go. Senator?
No, well, thank you for that, Rachel. That's the support we need. And thank you, Jackie, from Watertown. I mean, Watertown has done a great job focusing development in Watertown Square and seeing the opportunity there. I am 100% behind moving forward on all of these measures, and we're feeling our way. And I think we're going to come out with something bold. I know there's a lot of support in the Senate for doing something bold. So thank you again for having this panel, and again for your leadership, everybody on the panel and the chamber as well.
Thank you, Senator. Anybody else? Last words of wisdom? Jesse, I've never known you not to be.
Well, I know I've been saying yes in my backyard for many years. I think Rachel said it really well. We have to keep saying yes, every lever of power. Let's organize also in our own communities. Happy to help folks do that as it makes sense. It's been great to see so many advocates on this call, and make sure again, as things are moving forward in the Senate, that we're also putting some pressure on the House to act. So I really do implore you to call your state reps and make sure they understand and share with leadership in the House that we need to see action on that side of the Beacon Hill as well.
Andrew, Catherine?
I think there's cause for optimism. I know I tend to talk a lot about what's wrong with the status quo, but having these conversations that really bridge a lot of stakeholders is really important. And thank you to the Chamber for doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to echo what everyone else has said, sort of an optimistic framing, I've had the privilege of reading thousands of pages of meeting minutes on housing across Massachusetts. And one of the things that really stood out to my co-authors and me as we did the Greater Boston Housing Report Card was how many people in the room across some of the communities that we were studying were genuinely pushing for more housing and doing what pushing for that need, and it worked. And so I do think that there is a lot of space for folks to say yes and have it make a real difference.
Thank you all, and thank you everybody for listening. I will just add that a reminder that this is both morally and ethically and economically essential. We need to do this. We need homes for our adult children. We need homes for our young families. We need homes for our seniors. We need places for us to downsize and so on and so forth. You all know it, and we appreciate your time today. And I want to especially thank all the elected leaders from our communities, city councilors and select board members who were listening today to this conversation. We appreciate your thoughtfulness. And everybody, have a great day, everybody. We will see you next time.